Renata Sylvester stepped out of her silver Audi and stopped walking the moment she saw it. The truck was parked in the visitor section of the building's underground lot, 2 spaces from the accessible entrance, and it sat there the way something sits when it has no opinion about what you think of it. The paint, which had once been a deep forest green, had given up its color in patches across the hood and along the lower doors. The rear bumper was held by one bracket on the left side and memory on the right. There was a crack in the passenger mirror housing that had been wrapped in electrical tape at some point and forgotten. The man climbing out of it wore steel-toed work boots and a canvas jacket with a small rip near the left pocket. He reached back into the cab and lifted out a boy of about 9 who was holding a wooden box against his chest with both arms, the way children carry things they have built themselves. Renata watched this for a moment. Then she said, clearly enough that the 3 people walking toward the elevator heard it, "I didn't realize we still allowed service vehicles in the executive section." The boy looked up. The man did not. "Visitor pass," he said. "Science fair. Your building offered the courtyard." "We offered the courtyard to the school," Renata said, "not to the parking lot." She said it with the particular lightness of someone who has made this kind of remark before and found it useful. She walked past the truck without looking at it again and went inside. Behind her, one of the junior associates who had heard the exchange glanced back at the man and the boy. Neither of them had moved. The man had simply put his hand on the boy's shoulder and was speaking quietly to him, and the boy was nodding, still holding the wooden box, his face turned slightly down. The man's name was Owen Harte. He was 43 years old and had been a licensed marine diesel mechanic for 18 years. He worked out of a small shop north of the city, the kind of operation that did not advertise and did not need to, because the clients it had were the clients it had always had, and they were loyal for reasons that had nothing to do with pricing. The shop had been his father's before it was his. The truck had been his father's too. Renata Sylvester ran Sylvester Capital Group, a mid-sized private equity firm headquartered on the top 2 floors of the building she had just entered. She was 41. She had founded the firm at 34 and had spent 7 years building it into something that appeared in business publications with the regularity of a firm that had done something worth discussing. She drove herself to work, which she considered a form of discipline. She believed that the physical objects a person chose to keep around them were signals, and she read those signals the way some people read financial statements, quickly, confidently, and with the assumption that she knew what the numbers meant before she had finished looking at them. She had never stopped to ask herself whether that assumption had ever cost her anything. Julian Price was her operations director, and he was waiting near her office when she arrived. Julian was 47, meticulously dressed, and constitutionally unsuited to any form of disagreement with the person who signed his employment contract. He was good at his job within those limits, and Renata had long since made peace with what those limits were. Her executive assistant, Beth Carver, was already at her desk when Renata passed through the outer office. Beth was 32 and had been with the firm for 3 years. She was organized in the way that very precise people are organized, not as a performance of competence, but as the natural expression of a mind that found disorder physically uncomfortable. She did not make conversation for its own sake. She did not laugh at things she did not find funny. Renata valued these qualities without having spent much time thinking about what they said about Beth as a person. Beth's uncle, Clive Carver, was 64 years old and had spent 37 years working as a marine engineer, the last 20 of them as a restoration consultant for vintage and antique vessels and the mechanical systems that kept them running. He lived in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, in a house near the water with a workshop attached to it, and he received calls from his niece about things that had nothing to do with marine engines until 3 weeks ago. One of those calls had been about nothing else. Owen had parked in the visitor section because he had a visitor pass. The pass had been issued by the building's concierge desk after the school had arranged the science fair through the proper channels. He was not there to deliver anything or collect any form. He was there because his son, Felix, had spent 6 weeks building a model marine diesel engine from a kit that Owen had helped him source and had then deliberately not helped him assemble, because Felix had asked to do it himself, and Owen believed that was the right answer when a 9-year-old made that particular request. Felix had won the regional qualifier with the model. He was here for the city-level fair. After Renata had gone inside and the associate had followed and the parking lot had settled back into its ordinary quiet, Owen crouched down next to Felix and looked at the wooden box. "Don't let it bother you," Owen said. Felix looked at the entrance to the building. Why did she say that about the truck? Because she saw the outside and made a decision about it, but it's just rust. "It is," Owen said. Felix thought about this for a moment. He adjusted his grip on the box. "Grandpa's truck isn't just rust, though." "No," Owen said, "it isn't. They went inside. Beth had come downstairs to bring Renata a folder she had left in the car the previous evening, arriving at the edge of the parking lot in time to hear the exchange about service vehicles. She stood still with the folder in her hands. She watched Owen crouch next to Felix and speak to him quietly. She watched Felix nod. She watched them walk toward the building entrance. She went back upstairs. She did not say anything to Renata or to Julian. At her desk, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the keyboard without typing anything. Then she opened her drawer and took out a small notebook she kept for things she did not want to forget, and she wrote the time and the make of the truck, and below that, a single line. Look at the engine. She had no reason to write it other than this. She had grown up spending summers with her Uncle Clive, and she had learned from a young age that the outside of something told you almost nothing about the inside of something when the person who owned it did not care about appearances. Clive had once showed her a motorboat that looked like it had been dragged out of a lake after a decade underwater, and when he opened the engine compartment she had looked at what was inside and understood, without being told, that someone had cared about that engine the way other people cared about things in glass cases. The truck in the parking lot had made a sound when it pulled in. She had heard it from the stairwell, a low, even sound, unhurried and self-assured, the sound of something that did not need to explain itself. She called Clive that evening after work. "I have a question," she said. "Go ahead," she described the sound. Then she described what she had managed to see through the gap at the back of the hood when Owen had parked. The configuration of the intake, the unusual height of the secondary block, the shape of what she thought she could make out through 2 inches of clearance and morning light. She had photographed it with her phone. She described what she saw in the photograph. Clive was quiet on the other end for long enough that she looked at her phone to check the call was still connected. "The intake," he said finally. "You said it was offset to the starboard side, left side, yes, and you said there was a second block." "I think so. I couldn't see it fully." "Beth," he paused. "Where did this truck come from?" She told him what she knew, which was not much. He was quiet again. "It's probably nothing," he said. "Could be a custom rebuild, someone who knew what they were doing. But if the configuration is what you're describing and if the chassis is what I think it might be." He stopped. "I need you to get a better photograph." "I can try." "Don't try," he said. "Get the photograph." She got the photograph. The following morning, Felix's science fair ran from 9 until noon. Beth arrived early and found Owen in the east courtyard helping Felix set up the display. She approached carefully, giving enough distance that he could choose to acknowledge her or not. He looked up when she was still a few steps away. "From upstairs," he said. "Not as an accusation, as an identification of a fact." "Yes," she said. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday morning, what happened in the parking lot." He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't say anything. I was there." He appeared to consider this distinction and then nodded as if it had value. "Felix built that himself?" Beth asked, looking at the model engine on the display table. "He did. I showed him where to get the kit and then left him alone." Beth looked at the model. It was a miniature marine diesel, single-cylinder, accurate enough that someone who knew what they were looking at would know what they were looking at. "He got the fuel line routing right," she said. Owen looked at her differently then. Not with surprise exactly. With the specific alertness of someone who has just heard a word they did not expect from the direction they were looking. "My uncle restores marine engines," Beth said. "Vintage ones. I grew up around it." A brief pause. "I heard your truck pull in yesterday," she said, "through the stairwell, and I saw there was a gap in the hood. I took a photograph." She took out her phone and turned the screen toward him. "I called my uncle last night. He asked me to get a better one if I could." Owen was still for a moment. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked at her face. She did not look away. He walked to the truck. He unlocked it and lifted the hood, and Beth stepped forward and looked into the engine compartment the way her uncle had taught her to look at things, not for what was impressive but for what was true. She moved her angle. She let her eyes find the configuration. She looked at the secondary block and the intake and the routing of the oil lines, and she felt the particular stillness that comes when something you suspected turns out to be something larger than you suspected. She leaned in farther and looked at the left rear corner of the block, where the light was worst and where, in her uncle's experience, certain things sometimes were. There were letters there, cut directly into the casting. Not painted, not stamped on a plate, but machined into the metal itself in the patient, deliberate way that marks made to last are made, 2 letters and a date. The letters formed a name she knew, not from the automotive world, not from the world of cars and their histories, but from a chapter in one of her uncle's marine engineering books, a chapter she had read twice because the engineering described in it seemed impossible until you understood the era and the man who had done it. She straightened. She did not say anything immediately. She stood in the morning air next to Owen Harte's father's truck and put one hand on the edge of the engine bay and felt the cool of the metal and thought about what she was looking at. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. "Yes," Owen said. "Did your father know?" Owen looked at the engine the way she had seen her uncle look at something irreplaceable. Not with ownership, with recognition. "He's the one who told me. How long have you had it?" 13 years. He died in 2011. The truck was the only thing he left me. Beth stood back. She put her hands in her jacket pockets. She looked at the truck from the outside the way you look at something once you know what it is, and is a different experience than looking at something when you do not know what it is. The rust looked different. The held-together bumper looked different. Even the electrical tape on the mirror housing looked different, because you understood that the condition of the outside was not evidence of neglect. It was evidence of priorities. She called her uncle that evening and told him what she had seen. He was quiet for longer this time. "The machine signature," he said finally. "Yes, you're certain it was machined in, not added after?" "I'm certain." A longer silence. "Beth," Clive said, "that engine was built by one of 4 men on the planet who could have built it. I know that because I spent 8 years researching the provenance of that design series, and I couldn't confirm that more than 4 units were ever completed. 2 of them are in private collections in Norway and Japan. One was destroyed in a fire in 1987. The 4th one," he stopped. "The 4th one was supposed to be lost." "It isn't lost," Beth said. He made a sound she had never heard her uncle make before. Something between a word and something that was not a word. "That man needs to understand what he has," Clive said. "I think he does," Beth said. "No, I mean legally, documentarily. He needs provenance on record. I'll talk to him." She talked to him the next morning, in the courtyard again, after Felix had accepted a second-place ribbon with the gravity of someone who believed the judges had made a defensible but incorrect decision. Owen listened without interrupting while she told him what her uncle had said. He leaned against the brick wall of the courtyard with his arms crossed and his face in the expression of a man hearing something he already knew stated aloud for the first time. "I know what it is," he said again when she finished. "I believe you. But my uncle says you need documentation, not for sale, just for protection." Owen looked at the truck through the courtyard gate. "My father took it in as partial payment for a job in 1979. The client couldn't pay the full invoice. The engine had already been rebuilt once, and my father could see what it was. He didn't say much about it. He didn't say much about anything he cared about." Beth thought about that. About a man who carried something extraordinary through decades of ordinary days and never made a story of it because a story would have missed the point. "Would you let my uncle see it?" she asked. "He's in Lunenburg. He'd come to the city." Owen looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. Clive Carver drove to the city 2 weeks later. He arrived on a Thursday morning, early enough that the residential street where Owen lived was still mostly quiet. The street was modest, mid-century houses on narrow lots, the kind of neighborhood where the garbage cans were out by 7 and the neighbors knew each other's first names without being asked. Owen's property had a garage that was more organized than the house, which was itself organized in the particular way of a man raising a child alone in a space that was not large. Owen had the truck outside when Clive pulled up. He had not washed it, which was correct. Clive stepped out of his rental and looked at the truck for a long time before he went near it. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked slowly around the outside, looking at the body lines, the wheelbase, the angle of the cab. He crouched near the front wheel well and looked at something that Beth could not identify from where she was standing. He straightened and looked at the profile again, and there was something in his face that she recognized, the expression of a person confirming something they had been told and had tried not to fully believe until they could see it. Then he lifted the hood. He stood at the engine for 40 minutes. He used a flashlight from his jacket pocket and a small magnifying loupe that he carried the way surgeons carry the instruments they have carried for 30 years. He did not speak while he was working. Beth and Owen stood to the side and said nothing, because there is a kind of attention that cannot be interrupted without cost, and Clive's attention was that kind. When he straightened up, he stood with his hands flat on the edge of the engine bay the way he always stood when something had changed for him. "Felix," he said. The boy was sitting on the front steps with a library book about propulsion systems. He looked up. "Come here for a minute." Felix came over. Clive crouched to his height and aimed the flashlight into the corner of the engine block and held Felix's hand to aim it correctly. "You see those letters?" Felix leaned in with the total concentration of a 9-year-old who has decided a thing is worth his attention. "Yeah, that's a signature," Clive said. "The man who built this engine put his name on it, in the metal itself, so it couldn't be separated from the thing it was part of." Felix looked at the letters for a moment longer. Who was he? His name was Jonah Brecht. He was a marine engineer in Hamburg. He built engines for 50 years, and in those 50 years he built 4 engines that were different from any other engine he or anyone else had built. This is one of them. Felix looked up at his father. Grandpa knew. Your grandfather was a very good mechanic, Owen said. Good enough that someone trusted him with this. Felix looked back at the engine. He reached in and touched the letters with one finger very lightly, the way children touch things they have decided are important. So it's not just Grandpa's truck, he said. It's proof that Grandpa was good. Owen was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, that's exactly what it is. Clive filed a formal provenance assessment 2 days later. He submitted it to 2 independent marine engineering archives, one in Halifax and one in Bremen, where Brecht's records were held. Both archives responded within a week. The Bremen archives sent a researcher to the city. She was a woman in her mid-50s named Dr. Ingrid Wall, who carried a leather briefcase and spoke with the focused economy of someone who had spent 20 years handling objects that other people had handled carelessly. She looked at the engine for 3 hours. She photographed the signature from 7 angles. She examined the casting marks and the machining tolerances and the specific routing of the oil lines. She took measurements. When she was finished, she sat at Owen's kitchen table and opened her briefcase and took out a folder. The engine is the 4th unit of a series Brecht designed between 1963 and 1971, she said. It was completed in 1969. It was used as a test installation in a research vessel that operated out of Bremen until 1974. After 1974, we have a gap in the documentation. We had believed the engine was destroyed. The machine's signature is consistent with Bresnone marks on Units 1 and 2, which are in institutional collections. The tolerances are consistent with his hand-tooled finishing work. There is no credible argument against authenticity. She closed the folder. The engine has an appraised value in the range of $650,000 to $900,000 Canadian, depending on buyer interest and the completeness of the provenance documentation we can now assemble. With the full Bremen archive support, it will likely be at the higher end. Owen sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. I'm not selling it, he said. Dr. Wall looked at him. She had spent 20 years handling objects other people found incomprehensible to relinquish. She did not appear surprised. That is entirely your decision. The assessment is for your protection regardless of what you choose to do with the asset. I know, Owen said. I appreciate that. She left. Owen stood in his kitchen doorway and looked at the garage, where the truck was parked in the quiet in the dark with the hood down and the signature where it had always been, in the corner of the block, in the place where the light was worst, where it had sat for 56 years without anyone asking it to explain itself. The news moved the way these things move, first through specialized circles, then through the publications that covered those circles, then into one general interest piece that a journalist filed from Lunenburg after Clive agreed to an interview about the provenance process. The piece was careful and accurate, which was uncommon, and it ran with a photograph of the engine block that Dr. Wall had approved for publication. Felix saw it on his school's shared tablet, forwarded by a classmate who had recognized the truck from the science fair. He came home from school with the screen and stood in the kitchen in his jacket and backpack and held it up. Dad, the engine is in the news. Owen was at the counter. He turned around, looked at the screen, turned back. It's not news to us, he said. Felix sat down at the table and set the tablet in front of him. He looked at the photograph for a moment. The corner of the block, the letters, the shadow that fell across them in a way that made them look older than the light. Are you going to sell it? He asked. Owen set 2 plates on the table and sat down across from him. Do you think I should? Felix considered this with the thoroughness he brought to things he believed were worth considering. He pulled off his backpack and set it on the floor. He looked at the tablet and then at his father and then at the window that faced the driveway where the truck was parked. No, he said, because it's Grandpa's name on it, and he's not here to know people are saying he was good, but the engine is. Owen looked at his son. He said nothing for a moment. There was nothing that improved on what Felix had said. Eat, Owen said, it's getting cold. Felix ate. A week after the article ran, Renata Sylvester drove to the address that appeared in the public provenance filing. She drove herself. She did not bring Julian. She arrived in the early afternoon when the street was quiet and the driveway was empty except for the truck, which was parked the way it was always parked, close to the garage, door slightly crooked on its track, ordinary in every way that a person would notice if they were only looking at the outside. She had thought about what to bring and had settled on nothing, because anything she brought would have been a gesture, and gestures were what people used when they did not trust their words to carry what they needed to carry. She had decided to trust her words. She was not certain she deserved the confidence that required, but she thought the alternative was worse. Owen answered the door and looked at her without surprise. He stepped back from the door, which she took as an invitation, and she went inside. The house was small and lived in the way that houses are when someone has arranged them for use rather than for appearance. There were tools on a low shelf near the door. There was a drawing on the refrigerator that she recognized as a cross-section of something mechanical. There was a photograph on the windowsill that she did not look at long enough to interpret, except to note that there was a man in it standing next to a truck. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her hands at her sides. "What I said in the parking lot," she said, "was unkind. I said it in front of people, which made it worse. I said it in front of your son, which made it worst of all." She stopped. "I've been running a business for 7 years on the principle that surfaces tell you what's inside," she said. "I've used that principle to make fast judgments in situations that rewarded fast judgment. I never asked myself what it cost in the situations where it was wrong." Owen looked at her with the same quality she had noticed in the parking lot, not cold, not forgiving, just even. The quality of a person who has spent a long time being steady and for whom steadiness has become the natural resting state. "Felix asked me about it that night," he said, "why she didn't like our truck." Renata said nothing. "He's 9, Owen said. He doesn't need to absorb someone else's assumptions about value. I know, but he's fine." "He asked," I answered, and he moved on. "Kids do that." He said it without the tone of someone granting forgiveness. He said it as a fact about his son, which it was. "I'm sorry for the specific thing I said," I told him. "Not in a general way. The specific thing, in the specific moment, in front of the specific people." Owen nodded once. "I appreciate you coming to say it." She looked at the photograph on the windowsill. The man in it was younger than Owen by maybe 15 years, but the resemblance was clear, the same posture, the same quality of not needing to arrange himself for whoever was watching. His hand was on the hood of the truck. The photograph was summer bright, the kind of brightness that happens when someone stands outside with a camera and the person in front of them doesn't know they're being beautiful. "Is that your father?" she asked. 1983. He'd just finished rebuilding the engine for the second time. He was good at what he did. He was the best at what he did. Owen said, without defensiveness and without pride, the way people state things that have simply always been true. He just didn't work in places where that got noticed. Renata looked at the photograph for another moment. "There's a name in the engine," she said. "A signature. What does that mean to you?" "I mean personally, not in terms of the valuation." Owen looked at the photograph too. "My father worked in a small shop in New Brunswick for 32 years. He did good work every day, did work that other mechanics drove hours to watch him do, and he never thought that made him remarkable because for him it was just the work. The engine came to him because someone in Hamburg knew his reputation. Brecht's people sought him out." He paused. "The signature is not proof of what the engine is worth. The signature is proof that someone who was the best at something recognized my father as the best at something." He looked at her. "That matters differently than money," he said. "I can't explain it better than that." Renata looked at the floor of the kitchen for a moment. She thought about a framework she had carried for 7 years and had never examined from the outside. She thought about the speed with which she had read the truck in the parking lot and the confidence she had felt reading it, and the thing the reading had missed entirely, which was not the value of the engine but the whole story of a man who had been recognized by someone who knew what recognition meant. She thought about what it would have cost her. 7 years of fast judgments if the things she had misjudged had been the things that mattered. "Thank you for letting me in," she said. "Thank you for coming," Owen said. She walked back to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the garage door and the truck and the ordinary street in the ordinary afternoon. The specific quality of the light in that photograph, the summer brightness, the man with his hand on the hood not knowing he was being seen clearly for the first time. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly for the first time. She thought about how long it took some things to get there. She drove home. That evening, Owen opened the hood. He did not do it to check anything. The engine did not need checking. He did it because this was what he did in the evenings when the house was quiet, and Felix was in bed with his library book and the neighborhood had settled into its ordinary night sounds. The distant bark the car 2 streets over, the specific silence of a Canadian spring evening that is almost warm enough but not quite. He stood at the engine and looked at it in the way he always did, which was not the way of an owner assessing an asset but the way of a person in the presence of someone they miss. The letters were in their corner. They had always been there. They would be there after he was gone and after Felix was gone if Felix chose not to sell, and Felix would not choose to sell because Felix understood what the letters were for. Not documentation. Not valuation, recognition, machined into metal by a man who recognized another man's work as worthy of being permanently associated with his own. Owen put 2 fingers on the edge of the casting, not quite touching the letters. He had done this since he was a boy, since his father had first shown him, holding a flashlight in the cold garage of the New Brunswick house where everything smelled like oil and winter. Your grandfather was good at this, his father had said. Good enough that someone wrote his name next to theirs. Owen closed the hood, two-handed, deliberate, until the latch settled into place with the small solid sound it always made. He turned out the garage light and walked back inside. Down the hall, Felix was asleep. The library book on propulsion systems had slid off the bed and was lying open on the floor, pages down, which was the position it always ended up in. The window was cracked and the spring air moved through it, and the model engine on the shelf above his bed sat the way it had always sat, correct in every detail, assembled by a 9-year-old who had asked to do it himself. Owen turned off the hall light. The house settled into its quiet. The truck was in the garage. The signature was where it had always been, in the corner of the block, in the dark, not needing anyone to see it to be what it was. Some things don't need witnesses to be true. They just need someone who knows what they're looking at, and the patience to wait until that person comes along.